Before the words left her lips, I knew the war had begun. The question wasn't whether we could speak, but whether Oakhaven could survive the sound of us finally telling the truth. Chapter 1. The Ghost in the Shop. In Oakhaven, silence isn't just a lack of noise. It is a heavy, suffocating blanket that smells of damp wool and old regrets. I spent my morning the same way I spent every morning for the last 10 years, buried in the gears of a 19th century mantel clock, trying to fix a heartbeat that didn't belong to me. My shop was a sanctuary of mechanical ticking, a rhythmic armor against the world outside. Truth be told, I liked the clocks because they didn't ask questions I couldn't answer. I reached for a tiny screwdriver, my fingers steady, even though my soul felt like a hollowed-out shell. Through the glass of my storefront, the town was awash of charcoal and ash. People moved like shadows in the perpetual fog, nodding politely but never truly looking at one another. After that, I saw her, Elara Vance. She was walking toward the town hall with that same distant, focused gaze she'd worn since we were kids. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. I wanted to scream her name. I wanted to run out there and tell her that I still remembered the way her hair smelled like rain and jasmine. Instead, I just lifted my hand in a half-finished wave. The physical lock in my throat tightened until it burned. It was a familiar pain, a sharp reminder of the night I had tried to tell her I loved her, only to have the words dissolve into salt in my mouth. She didn't see me. She looked right through the glass through me as if I were nothing more than a smudge on the window. Because of that, the wave died in midair. I was a ghost, and ghosts don't get to have voices. Soon after, she stepped into the town hall, her beige coat disappearing into the gloom. I turned back to the clock on my bench, but something was wrong. The air in the shop suddenly felt thin, charged with a strange electric tension. I looked at the regulator clock on the wall, the one that never missed a beat in 50 years. In that moment, the brass pendulum simply stopped. No slowing down, no stuttering. It just froze at the apex of its swing. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was a roar. As the silence stretched, I realized every single clock in my shop had gone dead at the exact second she vanished from sight. Chapter 2. The Curator's Shadow. I couldn't stay in the shop with all those dead hearts staring at me. That's why I found myself in the town square, my boots clicking too loudly on the wet cobblestones. The fog was so thick I could taste the iron in it. I kept my head down, trying to blend into the gray. But the universe had other plans. Before I could move, a tall, thin figure stepped out from behind a statue of a forgotten founder. It was Silas, the curator. He moved without making a sound, his dark coat flowing around him like liquid ink. A quiet town is a healthy town. Wouldn't you agree, Julian? Silas asked, his voice a smooth, terrifying purr. He didn't look at me. He looked at the sky as if he could see the secrets hidden in the clouds. I felt an instinctive chill crawl up my spine. In fact, his presence felt like a draft from an open grave. I tried to speak, to offer some polite lie, but the words wouldn't come. I just nodded, my jaw tight. Truth be told, Silas scared me more than the silence did. The beauty of a well-oiled, quiet machine is that it never breaks its own heart, he continued, finally turning his pale, sharp eyes toward mine. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. You of all people should understand that. You fix the machines that keep our time. Don't go looking for a different rhythm. What followed was a silence so heavy, I felt like I was being buried alive. He patted my shoulder with a hand that felt like ice, then vanished back into the fog as quickly as he had appeared. I stood there trembling, my pulse racing like a runaway engine. I needed to get away, to find something real. Eventually, I wandered back toward the shop, my thoughts spinning in circles. Why did Silas look at me like he knew what I was thinking? Why did he care about the rhythm of my heart? Maybe it was fate, but as I reached for my door handle, my foot kicked a piece of damp paper wedged in the threshold. I picked it up, and the world tilted. It was an old sketch, charcoal lines of a girl laughing. It was Elara. It was 10 years old. She didn't know what scared her more, but I didn't even remember how my own voice sounded the day I drew it. Chapter 3. The Golden Thread. I spent hours staring at that sketch, the silence of the shop mocking me. By the time evening arrived, the fog outside had turned into a thick, impenetrable wall. I looked out the window again, hoping for a glimpse of her, but the street was empty. But then, the heavy oak doors of the town hall swung open. Elara stepped out, and for a second, I thought I was hallucinating. She was still wearing that plain, beige coat, but it didn't look beige anymore. No matter how hard she tried to hide it, there was a faint, golden glow pulsing along the seams of her sleeves. It was a soft light, like the first ray of sun hitting a morning mist. My breath caught in my throat. She looked exhausted, her shoulders slumped, but her eyes were darting around as if she were seeing things no one else could. As the wind shifted, she turned her head toward my shop. Our eyes locked through the glass. The moment their eyes locked, I felt a jolt of electricity shoot through my chest. It wasn't the look of a stranger. It was the look of someone waking up from a very long, very dark dream. She didn't look away this time. In the span of a breath, she began to cross the street, heading straight for my door. My heart skipped a beat, then another. I was frozen, my hands gripping the edge of the workbench so hard my knuckles turned white. As she reached the door, the golden glow from her coat seemed to brighten, casting long, dancing shadows against my walls. She looked different, less like a ghost and more like a woman carrying a fire she couldn't put out. She pushed the door open, and the bell chimed, a sound that felt like a thunderclap in the dead shop. Without thinking, I stood up. She stopped just inside the threshold, her chest heaving as if she'd been running for miles. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, she looked at me with an intensity that burned. I saw her lips move, but no sound came out at first. Still, the air between us thickened with a decade's worth of things we never said. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, glowing jar, and just like that, everything changed. Chapter 4. The Shattered Truth. The jar in Elara's hand was more than glass. It was a captured heartbeat, pulsing with a rhythmic amber light that made the shadows of my shop cower. Without another word, she stepped toward me, her boots treading softly over the discarded springs and brass shavings on the floor. I couldn't move, anchored by the sheer impossibility of the glow reflecting in her wide, desperate eyes. As if pulled by a string, my hand rose to meet hers, my fingers trembling as they neared the glass. The moment my skin brushed the surface, the hush of Oakhaven didn't just break, it detonated. A sensory tidal wave slammed into my chest, stealing the air from my lungs. Between one breath and the next, I wasn't standing in a dusty shop in 2026. I was 19 again, standing on the pier under a bruising purple sunset. I felt the humid salt air on my skin and the frantic, jagged pace of my own heart. In the echo of his voice, I heard the words I had choked on 10 years ago. They weren't goodbye or I'm sorry, as I had spent a decade believing. They were a raw, terrifying I love you that had been ripped from my soul and swallowed by the archive. The retroactive truth surged through my mind like a river breaking a dam. Just like that, my memory of Elara sneering at me on the pier dissolved into smoke, replaced by the reality of her tears. She hadn't hated me. She had been waiting for a word I was never allowed to say. Because of that, the cold, hollow space in my gut vanished, replaced by a heat so intense it felt like my blood was turning to liquid gold. I gasped, my knees buckling as the weight of 10 lost years crashed down on me. Moments later, the vision receded, leaving me gasping on the floor of my workshop. Elara was kneeling beside me, her hand resting on my shoulder, and for the first time in a decade, the touch didn't feel like a ghost's. Truth be told, I was terrified. If my entire life was built on a lie, what was left of the man I thought I was? Her voice trembled as she finally spoke, the sound low and gravelly like she was learning to use her throat for the first time. "It was Silas," she whispered. "He took it. He took all of them." Chapter 5. The Rewrite. The air in the shop began to hum, a low-frequency vibration that rattled the glass cases of the pocket watches, As the truth unraveled, I looked out the window and saw the gray fog of Oakhaven begin to churn. It wasn't gray anymore. It was turning a vibrant, terrifying shade of electric blue, swirling like an angry sea, which meant the town itself was reacting to the release of the word. Every lie we had lived was being challenged by the presence of that single glowing jar. I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing faster than any tourbillon I had ever balanced. No matter how hard she tried to stay calm, Elara's hands were shaking as she held the empty jar. "Julian, I found it in a misfiled crate," she said, her words coming faster now, fueled by a frantic urgency. "It has my name on it, but it's your voice inside. I broke the seal, and the world, it changed." What followed was a realization that chilled me to the bone. Silas hadn't just kept us quiet. He had stolen our history to keep the town under his thumb. I looked at my workbench, at the tools I had used to fix time. So I realized that the man I used to be, the passive observer, was dead. I grabbed my finest set of precision pliers and a heavy brass mallet, stuffing them into my leather apron. In that moment, I wasn't just a mender of clocks. I was a man who was going to help the woman he loved tear down a prison of silence. "If there are more jars," I said, my voice sounding strange and powerful in the vibrating room, "then there are more lives to fix." Chapter 6. The Architect of Noise. We stood in the center of the shop, the blue light from outside casting long, distorted shadows across the ceiling. As the silence roared, I realized that the lock in my throat was completely gone, replaced by a hunger to speak every word I'd ever suppressed. Yet a dark thought flickered in the back of my mind. If Silas found out we had broken the seal, he wouldn't just hush us. He would erase us. Despite that, I stepped closer to Elara, the space between us burning with a decade of unspent heat. "I can't say everything yet, Elara," I murmured, my hand reaching out to brush a stray hair from her forehead. The moment their eyes locked, I saw the same fire in her that was consuming me. "The archive, it's not just a library, is it? It's a cage." She nodded, her soul answering mine without a single word needed. As her wolf stirred, that primal, protective instinct she had carried in secret, she straightened her back, the golden light in her coat glowing with a new, defiant strength. Soon after, we heard a low, booming thud from beneath our feet, the archive itself groaning under the weight of the missing secret. To make things worse, I saw the sentient shadows Silas controlled beginning to seep through the floorboards like spilt ink. They were looking for the leak, and they were coming for us. Before either could speak, I grabbed Elara's hand, pulling her toward the back exit. "We need to find the others," I said, the words sharp and certain. "I can help you crack the jars Silas thinks are unbreakable." And just like that, everything changed as we stepped out of the dying shop and into a world that was finally starting to scream. Chapter 7. The Alchemy of Truth. The night air didn't just feel cold anymore. It felt sharp, like 1,000 tiny needles of reality pricking at my skin. That night, Elara and I moved through the back alleys of Oakhaven like two thieves stealing back the sun. The blue fog was so thick I could barely see my own boots, yet I could feel her presence beside me, as clearly as a hum on a wire. As if pulled by a string, she led me toward a small, lopsided cottage at the edge of the residential district. This was the home of Mrs. Gable, a woman who hadn't smiled since her son disappeared across the sea 20 years ago. Elara pulled a small, vibrating jar from the satchel at her hip. It wasn't amber like mine. It was a pale, weeping silver. As the silence roared, I watched her hands hover over the glass, but the lid wouldn't budge. Silas had wove a secondary seal around the grief category, a lock made of pure, hardened regret. Rather, it looked like a puzzle I was born to solve. I pulled a specialized tension wrench from my apron, my fingers moving with a precision that made the gears in my head sing. Because of that, I could see the invisible tumblers of the jar's magic shifting as I applied pressure. With every heartbeat, the silver light inside pulsed faster, reacting to my touch. I wasn't just fixing a clock. I was mending a bridge that had been burned decades ago. The moment their eyes locked, Elara gave me a small, encouraging nod that felt like a shot of pure adrenaline. With a final resonant click that echoed through the alley, the seal shattered. We didn't wait to be invited. Instead, we set the jar on the doorstep and tapped on the glass. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, Elara whispered the trigger word, and we ducked into the shadows, just as Mrs. Gable opened her door. Chapter 8. High-definition souls. What followed was a transformation that defied every law of physics Silas had ever taught us. As Mrs. Gable touched the silver light, the retroactive truth hit her with the force of a gale. Her face, which had been a map of gray wrinkles and sorrow, suddenly flushed with a vibrant rosy color. In fact, the lopsided cottage itself seemed to straighten, the peeling paint shimmering back into a bright, cheerful white. Truth be told, she wasn't just remembering her son's last words. She was living in a reality where those words had never been stolen. I watched, mesmerized, as the world around the cottage sharpened. The grass turned a deep, impossible emerald, and the smell of jasmine, fresh and sweet, cut through the metallic tang of the fog. As the truth unraveled, I realized I was seeing the world in high definition for the first time in my life. The archive had been a filter, a gray lens that made everything dull and manageable. Without thinking, I reached out and took Elara's hand, my skin sparking against hers. Her body moved on instinct, leaning into me as we watched a woman's entire life rewrite itself in the span of a few seconds. Still, the wonder was cut short by a sound that made my marrow turn to ice. It was a low, rhythmic thrumming, like the beating of a giant, subterranean heart. As the sky darkened, the blue fog began to coil and hiss, forming into long, spindly shapes that drifted toward the light we had just released. The sentient shadows were no longer just seepage. They were hunters. She didn't know what scared her more, the shadows themselves or the fact that they seemed to be following the scent of our shared heartbeats. Chapter 9. The Hushed Hunter. We retreated deeper into the labyrinth of the town, our breaths coming in synchronized gasps. Every step he took felt heavier, as if the archive were trying to pull us back into the ground by our heels. We reached the town square, but we stopped dead. Silas was standing near the fountain, his back to us, but he wasn't alone. As if summoned, a dozen shadows stood around him, their forms flickering like bad reception. He was holding a small, empty jar, tapping his fingernail against the glass with a terrifying, rhythmic precision. "Noise is a disease, Julian," Silas said, his voice carrying over the square without him even turning around. "And you are becoming quite the carrier." Before the words left her lips, Elara pulled me behind a stone pillar, her heart racing against my arm. The tension broke when one of the shadows lunged toward our hiding spot, its fingers like smoke-stained claws. Her instincts surged and she shoved me toward the narrow alleyway leading to my workshop. "Go," she mouthed, her eyes filled with a fierce, protective light. Moments later, we were pinned in the alley, the shadows closing in from both sides. I gripped my brass mallet, ready to fight a war I didn't know how to win. But then, Elara did something I never expected. She uncorked a jar of pure joy we hadn't even categorized yet. The blast of golden light was so bright it blinded the shadows, sending them shrieking back into the cracks of the cobblestones. Between them, something cracked. The barrier between the world of silence and the world of sound was failing. We reached the shop and slammed the door, but my relief died the moment I looked at the counter. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, I saw it. A jet-black jar, cold as a winter grave, sitting exactly where I had left my sketch. Chapter 10. The Architect's Ruin. The black jar sat on my workbench like a tumor on a clean heart. Truth be told, just looking at it made my teeth ache and my vision blur at the edges. It didn't pulse like the others, it absorbed the light around it, creating a pocket of absolute void in the middle of my shop. Soon after, Elara reached for it, her fingers hovering inches from the glass. "Don't," I rasped, my voice sounding like gravel under a heavy boot. Because of that, she froze, her face pale in the flickering candlelight. I could feel the archive beneath us groaning, a deep, tectonic shudder that made the hanging clocks swing in frantic, silent arcs. As the silence roared, I realized this wasn't just another suppressed word. This was a black jar, the kind Silas spoke of in whispers, a secret so toxic it could shift the literal geography of Oakhaven. On the other hand, we couldn't just leave it there. If Silas had left it for us, it was a lure, or worse, a test. Without thinking, I picked up my specialized mender's loop and peered through the dark glass. Inside, something moved, a swirling, oily mass of obsidian smoke. As her pulse raced, Elara whispered, "Julian, look at the base." Etched into the glass was a name that made the floor feel like it was falling away. Thorne. It was my family's secret. Chapter 11. The midpoint shift. What followed was a moment of pure, unadulterated terror. I had spent my life thinking I was a nobody, a silent fixer of broken things. But the jar told a different story. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, Elara watched me carefully, her hand resting on the small of my back. I took a deep breath and applied the resonance fork to the seal. The moment their eyes locked, I felt a wave of nausea. But I didn't stop. The glass didn't shatter. It dissolved. In that moment, the secret didn't just enter my mind, it rewrote the street outside. A massive Victorian manor suddenly surged out of the fog across the street, its timbers groaning as it forced its way into reality, where an empty lot had been for 50 years. As the truth unraveled, I saw my father standing in the doorway of that ghost house, his face twisted in the same silent rage I remembered from my nightmares. But the word he had swallowed wasn't a curse. In fact, the word was, "I'm proud of you." He had died before he could say it, and Silas had bottled that pride to keep me small, kept me believing I was a failure. Deep down, she knew the truth, and so did I. My entire identity was a cage Silas had built from my own father's withheld love. Chapter 12. The Shadow's Reach. I collapsed against the workbench, a choked, raw sob finally breaking the decade of stillness in my chest. As the echo faded, I felt Elara's arms wrap around me, her warmth the only thing keeping me from dissolving into the blue fog. Still, the victory of the truth was short-lived. The archive began to rumble with a violent, rhythmic intensity, sounding like a cornered beast. To make things worse, the shadows outside the shop window began to merge, forming a towering, faceless wall of hush that blotted out the stars. Silas appeared in the center of the street, his silhouette framed by the sudden appearance of my father's house. Even so, he didn't look angry. He looked disappointed. "You've thinned the walls too much, Julian," he shouted over the rising wind. "The equilibrium is breaking, and the town will drown in the chaos of your feelings." Before either could speak, a dozen shadows smashed through my front window, their smoke fingers reaching for the black jar. Her instincts surged, and Elara grabbed my hand, pulling me toward the cellar door. "He's coming for the master jar, Julian," she cried. "If he secures it, we'll be silent forever." And just like that, everything changed, as we plunged into the dark, racing toward the heart of the archive. Chapter 13. The Resonance of Rebellion. The cellar stairs felt like the descent into a throat, the air growing thick with the metallic tang of suppressed energy. That night, every step we took deeper into the earth made the lock in my chest throb with a phantom rhythm. Elara held her lantern high, the golden light from her sleeves bleeding into the surrounding darkness. Because of that, I could see the cracks in the foundation of the world above, weeping blue mist like an open wound. As if pulled by a string, I reached into my toolkit and pulled out my heaviest brass tuning fork, a tool meant for giant grandfather clocks, now repurposed for the gears of fate. What followed was a moment of silent, mutual understanding that didn't need a single jar to explain. We reached the heavy iron doors of the master chamber, where the air hummed with a frequency so low it made my teeth rattle. In fact, the pressure was so great that my nose began to bleed, the red drops looking black in the flickering light. Elara looked at me, her eyes reflecting the terrifying weight of what we were about to do. Deep down, she knew the truth. If we crossed this threshold, the Julian Thorne who fixed clocks for a living would be gone forever. Without thinking, I slammed the tuning fork against the iron door, the vibration shattering the magical seal in a shower of sparks. Chapter 14. The Master's Trap. The chamber was a cathedral of glass, thousands of jars suspended from the ceiling by threads of silver shadow. In the center sat the Master Jar, a massive, pulsing vessel of iridescent light that contained the collective identity of Oakhaven. As the silence roared, I saw Silas standing atop a glass dais, his hands hovering over the Master Jar like a conductor. To make things worse, he wasn't trying to hide anymore. He was absorbing the light, his eyes turning into 2 points of cold white fire. Maybe it was fate, but I realized he didn't want peace. He wanted the power of every word ever spoken. "You think you're a hero, Julian?" Silas sneered, his voice echoing through the chamber like a funeral bell. "You're just a boy who can't handle the weight of his own father's ghost." Before the words left her lips, Elara lunged forward, but the shadows rose up like a wall of obsidian glass, pinning her against the floor. As her wolf stirred, she snarled, a sound so raw and animalistic it made my blood run cold. As if fate demanded it, I stepped forward, holding my tuning fork like a sword. Because of that, Silas laughed, a dry, rattling sound that made the suspended jars chime in a dissonant, terrifying chorus. Chapter 15. The Final Commitment. The air in the chamber grew cold enough to frost my eyelashes as the hush intensified. Under the weight of his stare, I felt my knees begin to buckle, the old invisibility trying to wrap its cold fingers around my throat again. Still, I looked at Elara, trapped and fighting, her light fading under the pressure of Silas's shadows. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, I realized that my love for her was the only word Silas couldn't bottle because I hadn't even found the courage to say it yet, which meant the power was still mine. "I'm not the boy you remember, Silas," I shouted, the volume of my own voice surprising me. As the tension broke, I struck the dais with my mallet, the sound wave rippling through the glass chamber and causing a dozen minor jars to shatter. Without another word, Silas raised his hand, and the Master Jar turned a violent, bruised purple, the color of a suppressed scream. As though fate whispered, I knew that breaking this jar would destroy the archive, but it might also erase the very memories that made me love Elara. And just like that, everything changed, as I made my choice, raising my hammer for the strike that would end the world as I knew it. Chapter 16. The Great Hush. The hammer was inches from the Master Jar when Silas's eyes flared with a blinding, necrotic white light. Without warning, he didn't fight my strike with force. Instead, he reached into the air and caught the very sound of my heartbeat. He slammed his fist into the Master Jar, but it didn't break. Rather, a shockwave of absolute pressurized silence exploded outward, a jar of absolute silence that turned the air into a solid, suffocating block of lead. As the silence roared, my hammer didn't hit glass. It hit a wall of frozen time, the impact vibrating back through my arms until my bones felt like they were shattering into dust. Before she could move, Elara was engulfed by the same gray void, her golden glow snuffed out as if a candle had been pinched by a giant's fingers. I tried to scream her name, but my vocal cords felt like they had been replaced by dry sand. Because of that, the world vanished. I wasn't in the vault anymore. I was drifting in a sensory deprivation tank where even my own thoughts felt muffled and distant. To make things worse, I felt Silas's cold voice echoing inside my skull, mocking me. "You wanted silence, Julian. Now you shall have the silence of the void." Moments later, the floor gave way, and I felt myself falling into a bottomless pit of gray, heavy fog. Chapter 17. The Graveyard of Statues. Come morning, or what felt like morning in a world without sun, I found myself lying on the cold cobblestones of Oakhaven's town square. The blue fog was gone, replaced by a gray mist so thick it tasted like wet ash. Still, the silence was the most terrifying part. I stood up, my joints creaking, and looked around at a town that had become a graveyard of living statues. In fact, I saw the baker standing with his hand on a door handle, frozen mid-step, his eyes wide and vacant. Every person I passed was pinned by the hush, their voices not just stolen, but their very souls paralyzed by the weight of what they hadn't said. I stumbled toward my shop, my breath hitching in a chest that felt like it was filled with stones. No matter how hard she tried to find me, Elara was nowhere to be seen. I reached the storefront and saw my own reflection in the cracked window. Deep down, he knew the truth. I looked exactly like the man my father said I would be. A hollowed-out failure who couldn't protect the one thing that mattered. As if fate demanded it, I looked at my hands, the hands of a mender, and realized I didn't even have my tools. Silas had stripped me of my craft, my voice, and my woman. What's worse, I couldn't even remember the sound of Elara's laugh. Chapter 18. The Dark Night of the Soul. I sat on the floor of my ruined shop, surrounded by the shattered glass of 1,000 clocks that would never tick again. As the silence roared, I felt the final spark of hope inside me begin to flicker and die. The archive had won. The equilibrium was restored at the cost of every human heart in Oakhaven. Yet, as I stared at the spot where I had left my sketch of Elara, I saw a tiny microscopic glint of light in the dust. Maybe it was fate, but it wasn't a jar. It was a single brass screw from a watch, the one I had been fixing the morning she first walked by. I picked it up, and the cold metal bit into my palm. Because of that, a sudden, sharp memory pierced through the gray void. I remembered the feeling of her hand on mine, a sensation that Silas couldn't bottle because it wasn't a word. It was an action. In that moment, I realized that Silas's power relied on us waiting for him to give us back our voices. As if pulled by a string, I stood up, my resolve hardening into something sharper than any blade. I didn't need a jar to be heard. Her soul answered mine across the distance, a faint pulse of warmth in the cold. And just like that, everything changed as I realized that the loudest sound in the world isn't a shout. It's the strike of a hammer against a cage. Chapter 19. The Rhythm of Resistance. The gray mist in the shop felt like it was trying to swallow my very skin, but the tiny brass screw in my palm burned like a miniature sun. Truth be told, the hush was no longer a magical curse I had to wait to be lifted. It was a physical barrier I had to break. I looked at the heavy iron anvil in the corner of my workshop, then at the metal lampposts lining the street outside. Maybe it was fate, but I realized that sound travels through bone and steel long after the air goes dead. Because of that, I didn't reach for a delicate screwdriver. I grabbed my heaviest forging hammer and stepped out into the graveyard of a town. Without thinking, I swung the hammer with every ounce of my suppressed fury, slamming it against the base of the iron post. The sound didn't just ring, it shivered through the ground, a deep, resonant thrum that cracked the gray silence like a sheet of ice. As the echo faded, I saw the frozen statue of the baker twitch, a spark of life returning to his vacant eyes. What followed was a frantic rhythmic symphony of steel on steel as I moved from post to post, striking each one with a beat that matched my own racing heart. As if pulled by a string, the townspeople began to stumble out of their paralysis, drawn toward the vibration that was waking their dormant souls. Chapter 20. The Mender's Call. Soon after, I saw a flash of golden light near the town hall steps, flickering like a dying firefly in a storm. It was Elara, her beige coat torn and her eyes clouded with the gray film of the void, but she was moving. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, she saw me, not the ghost she had looked through for 10 years, but a man who was literally shaking the earth to find her. In that moment, I didn't need to speak. The rhythm of my hammer told her everything she needed to know. Yet the shadows weren't finished. They surged out of the gutters, trying to mute the vibrations with their ink-stained hands. No matter how hard she tried to reach me, the shadows formed a wall of cold air between us, hissing with the stolen whispers of 1,000 ancestors. Still, the townspeople weren't just watching anymore. They began to pick up stones, metal pipes, and wooden beams, mimicking the beat I had started. In fact, The entire town square began to vibrate with a collective, defiant heartbeat that made the very windows of the town hall rattle in their frames. Because of that, the shadows began to fray at the edges, unable to maintain their form against a truth that was being felt rather than heard. Her name hung in the air, not as a sound, but as a promise, as we converged on the entrance to the archive for the final time. Chapter 21. The Ascent to the Tower. We breached the doors of the town hall, but we didn't head down into the cellar this time. As the sky darkened, I looked up at the great clock tower that loomed over Oakhaven, the place where the master jar had been moved to stabilize the hush over the entire county. What's worse, Silas stood at the top, silhouetted against the giant clock face, his silhouette looking like a jagged tear in the fabric of the world. Before the words left her lips, Elara grabbed my hand, her touch no longer hesitant but grounding and fierce. As the silence roared one last time, we began to climb the winding wooden stairs, each step a declaration of war against the stillness. The gears of the great clock were jammed with the same black oily smoke that filled the jars, the hands frozen at the minute Silas had claimed our lives. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, I realized that the master jar was the only thing powering this false time. Without another word, I reached the top platform and faced Silas, who was cradling the iridescent vessel like a precious, stolen child. As though fate whispered, I saw the fear in his eyes, the fear of a man who realized that a mender knows exactly where the weakest point of a system lies. And just like that, everything changed as I raised my hammer, locking eyes with Elara, ready to trade the comfort of our silence for the chaos of our truth. Chapter 22. The Shattering of Time. The air at the top of the clock tower was so thick with suppressed screams it felt like wading through deep water. In that moment, Silas clutched the master jar to his chest, his face a mask of desperate, hollow authority. What followed was the final confrontation, the air between us humming like a wire about to snap. I didn't hesitate. I stepped onto the glass-slick platform, my forging hammer feeling like an extension of my own arm. Because of that, Silas let out a ragged, soundless cry, his white fire eyes widening as I swung. The hammer met the master jar with the force of a falling star. Between one breath and the next, the glass didn't just break. It detonated into 1,000,000 shards of pure, unadulterated light. A shockwave of golden resonance exploded outward, tearing through the roof of the clock tower and punching a hole in the gray sky. As the silence roared its final dying note, the iridescent liquid inside the jar splashed over me, over Elara, and flooded down into the streets of Oakhaven. Without warning, the hush was obliterated, replaced by a deafening, beautiful cacophony of 1,000 people finally finding their voices at once. Chapter 23. The Falling Action Moments. Later, the giant gears of the clock tower groaned and began to turn, the ancient metal teeth grinding away the last of the black smoke. I looked toward the dais, but Silas was gone, dissolved into the very shadows he had used to enslave us. Still, the world felt like it was spinning too fast as the retroactive truth flooded my mind, filling in the gaps of my stolen years. I saw Elara standing near the edge of the platform, her beige coat now a brilliant sun-drenched gold. The moment their eyes locked, I felt a sharp pang of fear. I knew the price of breaking the master jar was the memory of the lie. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, she reached for me, her lips moving, but for a second, I couldn't remember why my heart knew her so well. The light began to fade, settling into a soft, warm glow that coated the town like honey. By the time I reached the street, the gray statues had turned back into people, messy, crying, shouting, laughing people. I saw the baker hugging his rival, their feud forgotten in the wake of the truth. In fact, the manor house across from my shop remained, solid and real, a monument to a father's pride that was no longer hidden. Deep down, she knew the truth, and as she walked toward me through the cheering crowd, my heart began to beat that same rhythm I had found in the shop. Her soul answered the silent question in my eyes, and as I whispered her name, the memories didn't just return, they were reborn, stronger than the glass that had held them. Chapter 24. The New Equilibrium. Come morning, Oakhaven looked like a different world entirely. The fog was gone, replaced by a sky so blue it hurt to look at, and the silence had been replaced by the wonderful, chaotic noise of a town that was finally alive. What's worse for the shadows, they were gone, vanished into the light of 1,000 spoken truths. I stood in front of my shop, which I had renamed The Echo and the Gear. Because of that, I was no longer a ghost fixing clocks. I was a man helping people find the words they had lost. As if fate demanded it, Elara was there beside me, her hand in mine, her voice a constant, beautiful melody in the air. Truth be told, the world was louder than I ever expected, and sometimes the truth was messy and painful. Yet, I wouldn't trade a single second of this beautiful noise for the safety of the vault. Not only that, but I realized that a brave heart doesn't need a loud voice to change the world. It just needs the courage to be heard. As the wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain and jasmine, I looked at Elara and smiled. And just like that, everything changed as we walked into our new reality, knowing that in Oakhaven nothing would ever be swallowed again. Epilogue. The Conversation Hub. 1 year later, the subterranean vault has been transformed into a sunken garden, where the glass shelves now hold flowers instead of secrets. I sit in my shop, the door wide open to the bustling street, teaching a new generation that time isn't something to be trapped but something to be shared. Maybe it was fate, but I see a young boy struggling to find the words to thank me for fixing his toy. I lean down and whisper, "Don't be afraid of the sound, son, that's just your heart talking." As fire bloomed beneath her skin, Elara appears in the doorway, and I don't just wave, I shout her name for the whole world to hear. Her bones remembered him, and as she laughs, I know that our story is finally perfectly loud. The end.